All right, everyone. Welcome to our next discussion here. This is around mail flow and transport. Now remember, keep this in mind, we're going to be focusing on Exchange in particular here. So we are not going to talk too much outside of Exchange. Everything's going to be focused on how Exchange handles mail. When it receives it, how does it work? It's actually quite complicated, actually, when you think about it. There's quite a lot going on, and we're going to dive into that. Microsoft has a lot of great pieces here that we can work through to get a good idea of how this works. And then we'll also have some really nice some diagrams we can look at too, because that helps out too. All right, let's dive right into it. So mail flow. So, well, let's first and foremost start talking about Exchange. Come on, there we go. All right, so Exchange Server, as we looked at from our server inside of the domain controller that we created, remember it was just a member server, and eventually we promoted it to a specific server. And it was a role that it had, and that was the Active Directory Domain Services role that we installed on it, and then we promoted it to a domain controller. Well, Exchange works in a similar manner here, where they essentially, it starts off as a member server, we install Exchange on it, and it becomes a server. Now there are different types, and I got to do a little bit of a backtrack here to show you where we've come from to where we go. So I'm going to kind of really focus in on the modern versions of Exchange. Yes, the first one I'm talking about here is 2010, because in this one here we had 4 roles, essentially, that Exchange could have. The first one was Hub Transport, Client Access, Mailbox, and Edge. Now what that means is that you could absolutely have one server have all of them. You could have a server that for each one of these. And that was actually pretty common to split these roles out onto servers. So Hub Transport, really think of it from this perspective. It is a way of delivering mail, which we're going to be talking about with the mail flow aspect of it. This is a big piece of it nowadays. The Hub Transport role is a way of delivering mail. It's the pipelines that it flows through to get to the destination, wherever that is. And that's going to be on the flip side there, where is Mailbox. So Mailbox is the actual storage location. So this is going to be in the form of databases where our mail is essentially stored. So once it gets through the Hub Transport layer, it's going to jump to the Mailbox, which will essentially be stored inside of the Mailbox in the database. Then we have Client Access, which, as the name implies, this is how users are front-ending to the Exchange piece. This is how they're connecting via OA, Outlook Anywhere, Exchange ActiveSync, any of those functions. And then we have Edge. I'm going to leave Edge for a little bit more of a discussion when it comes to the hygiene, but I'll be honest with you, I don't really see Edge servers too much anymore. Edge servers are a way of shielding our production servers from being connected directly to from either the internet or a hygiene appliance. They sound on paper make sense, but generally what we're dealing with nowadays is almost every organization has some form of we'll say an antivirus, anti-spam. We got a whole section around that, so don't worry too much about that right now. But you have something in front of it, in front of your Exchange server, which is fine. Most of the organizations don't necessarily care. We don't need an Edge server that hits our DMZ and then gets forwarded back to our production LAN. Most of the time, they'll go directly from the Mimecast or again, whatever it is, directly to our Exchange servers in the LAN, traditionally. Now, back then, that was a little bit different when Exchange 2010 came out, so things were a tiny bit different, which is why we had 4 roles. So the Edge server is just not as utilized, but it definitely does have its use for certain organizations. The next role, or the next Exchange version that came out was 2013, which you'll notice here that we're shrinking, and you're going to start seeing that as a pattern, where the Hub Transport is no longer a role, a separate role that we can install on a server. And it was at this time, and honestly it would happen in 2010, but the best practice was to consolidate and have a multi-rolled server and make each Exchange server an island unto its own. So we would not have many servers for Hub Transport, many servers for Client Access, and many servers for Mailbox servers or Mailbox roles. We would not really split the roles out. That's not necessarily a good practice anymore. It just A, complicates things, and then B, it just starts making you just have more servers. It would not be unheard of to have 100 Exchange servers in your organization. Could you imagine being in charge of 100 Exchange servers? Like, that's insane. Just a ton of servers you are responsible for. If any of them fall or fail or whatever happens to some of them, it could be catastrophically down. was way too much to worry about. It was too complicated. So Microsoft took the hub transport role and split it in half. We put the transport on the mailbox side, and then we put on the front end, we have the submission, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Still have the edge server, still around as needed. So in the modern clients where we have 2016, and I just put 2016 plus because I'll be 100% honest with you, the difference between Exchange Server 2016 and Exchange Server 2019 is very minimal. And for the scope of this course here, it's really not necessary to know the difference between them. Just know that 2016 and above, we all have consolidated. So again, look at this, has been slowly whittling away at it to make it less complex. And that's been Microsoft's goal here, is that we have mailbox servers and edge servers. Again, if you don't use edge servers in your organization, which I will be honest with you, I would say out of every 100 customers I work with, 98 of them don't use edge servers. We'll put it that way. That still have on-premise, which again, it's been probably about a year since I've actually had a customer who is fully on-premise and is looking to upgrade their on-prem. Almost every single one of them is looking to get rid of their on-prem and go to the cloud. So we'll talk about that later on. But mailbox server, that's the only role we would have. So we would have one server doing everything, which again, that was Microsoft's best practice. It still is, obviously, to the point where, well, you're forced to do it. You can't not do it anymore. So the roles themselves, whatever the server was doing, did a lot of different things. Really, client access, there's a big piece there. We want to make sure that our clients can connect to it, whatever you may be connecting to. We want to make sure that you are connecting to be able to access your mailbox and get your mail flow in and out. That's where the hub transport layer is, and then of course the mailbox that hosted our data. So that was important as well. All right, so Exchange itself, when we're looking at mail, has many different functionalities, but really at the end of the day, it is a database where all of our mail is stored. Just another database. Now, it's a much different database, of course, than what Active Directory is, as we've already talked about, but it's just a database for stuff. Again, and in this particular instance, the stuff are going to be calendars, contacts, email, all of those things that we've talked about already. So now as we continue progressing here, let's start breaking apart the mailbox delivery side. So really what we're looking at here is the mailbox portion of it, and as well as the hub transport. So since everything essentially has been consolidated into the mailbox role, client access is certainly a part of this as well, but we're going to separate these logically, where we're going to talk about mail flow coming in and out of the organization and being delivered. And then in the next discussion, we'll talk about the client access experience and what we can do with that too. So let's look at the transport pipeline. So how do we get mail? If a piece of mail comes into our organization, how does it know to deliver the mail? Well, there are many services working together to deliver the mail. Okay, so we got to look at this as a whole, is that there are services working in the back end, the Microsoft services that are running on the back end of an Exchange server that are moving mail to its destination, wherever that may be, inside, outside, wherever. Internal mail is a thing too. Remember that. Not all mail is going outbound. A lot of it's just going database to database or maybe intra-database. So we need to be able to know where it's at. So Exchange needs to know where to go. So let's start looking at some of these services here. So we have the first one here, which is the front-end transport service. So what this one here is, it's a stateless proxy that handles inbound and outbound mail. So what this is it sits on the front end of the server, the front end, the very beginning portion. And a lot of this will make a little bit more sense when we look at the diagram here, but I want to at least give you the definitions of these first, talk a little bit about them, then we can look at the diagram. The front end portion starts, as the name implies, in the front end. What the heck is a stateless proxy? Well, stateless proxy means that no data is analyzed, it's not configured, there's nothing happens with the data, it essentially doesn't sit there, it just goes through it to figure out where the destination is, whether it's going outbound to the internet, so again from your mailbox database through the hub transport layer outbound to the internet, or it's coming from Sally is sending an email to Joe and they're inside of the organization. Does it hit the front end? Well, yeah, it certainly could, depending on the scenario. And then we also have inbound mail. So somebody's coming, Matt at domain.com is sending to Joe at, example.com. Well, that front end transport's going to hit it. So we'll talk about those and we'll start looking at this a little bit further. The next, we have transport service. So, like I said, remember when Joe and Sally were sending an email inside of the organization? In certain circumstances, it may hit the front end. However, the vast majority of intra-organization mail flow is going to happen with the transport service. So this is where when I am sending, I'm inside of a database, or if I am, again, inside of the organization, that is where I'm going to be sending my mail, and the vast majority of times it will hit this transport service. So keep in mind here, an organization, and we're going to use this term a lot, an organization is another term for a logical exchange group. Okay, so inside of Exchange, we're not looking at domains because we may have multiple domains that Exchange is responsible for. So it's not just a domain. An organization is a collection of everything, whereas inside of Active Directory, your forest essentially is kind of the big piece there that combines all of our domains and trees and everything into one. Well, an Exchange organization is pretty much the same there, where we're keeping track of all of our Exchange servers, authoritative domains, all of those things, and we're going to get onto those here. All right, so the front end is where mail will hit, and this is where it always hits first. No matter where it is, it's going to hit one of these two services. So when it hits one of these two services, then what happens? Well, remember, we got to get mail to mailboxes. We have recipients that are coming in. Mail's coming into the organization. We have mail coming inside of the organization to people. We need to be able to deliver it. So Exchange, in its own right, has two instances here, which we're going to dive into, is the mailbox transport submission, which is going to transport mail to the transport service from the mailbox database. Okay, so this is going to be essentially for, we'll say it outbound mail, but outbound from the individual user's mailbox. So that may be intra-organization, meaning that Joe is sending to Sally, but it's always from Joe's perspective is going to use the mailbox transport submission service. Whereas the other side is the mailbox transport delivery service. This one here is going to deliver to the local mailbox database. So we have Joe is over in database 1, Sally's in database 2. They're going to send an email out. So Joe's going to send it through the mailbox transport submission. It's going to be delivered to Sally, which is going to hit the mailbox transport delivery service and deliver to her mailbox. When she responds, it does the exact same thing it did for Joe. It's going to the submission service, then it goes to the delivery service. So important to understand that. But these are just words that I'm showing you here. I have a reference here, and I have a nice Microsoft diagram that I'm going to bring up so we can look at this, because this one paints a little bit bigger and a nicer of a picture. So here's a wonderful Microsoft article. So this one shows mail flow and transport pipeline. This is how mail moves in an organization. It's very important to understand that here, because moving mail is so important, and that's actually, as I said, quite complicated it can get. So here's our services that we've just talked about already. I omitted transport service on Edge servers because honestly it's the same thing as the transport service in its own right. So when a piece of mail hits Exchange here, when it kind of listens internally, it's going to be delivered through any of these services. So let's look at it. Here's everything we have. Here's an Exchange 2016 mailbox server. We have our front end service. We have our transport service, which is kind of in the middle. And then we have our mailbox transport service. Now, there's a lot going on in this particular article here in this diagram. Don't necessarily be overwhelmed by it, because I just want you to look at it. They're trying to accommodate for every instance of mail flow, which is a lot. Because again, we have inside, we have intra-org, we have outside of the organization, we have mail coming from the outside of the organization in. So we got to look at all the different avenues that this can possibly come in. So we'll start up here at the top. So remember, that front end transport service does, well, not really much of anything, to be completely honest with you. What's going to happen here is we're going to have an external SMTP, and you can follow this line here, is coming in to our organization. So somebody is sending to one of our recipients. It's going to come here, and it's going to hit this SMTP receive, which is the transport service. It's going to be forwarded over to SMTP send, and it's going to go in one of two directions. It's going to go down that, hey, remember when we got that whole, the mail flow piece coming in, this comes in, it's going to say, hey, this person doesn't exist, we're going back out, potentially. Or, hey, this person does exist, we're going to queue it. So it goes down, submit for queue. That's where it jumps in from here and jumps down to SMTP receive over here, which in the transport service, we have our submission queue. Now you'll notice that in the front end service, as well as the mailbox service, none of this is queued. Everything is always queued here in this transport service. So this is a stateless proxy. There is no data being analyzed here on this service as well as this service. Well, this service, I guess you could say it is, but I guess in theory it's not. We'll put it that way. But mostly the big piece here is this stateless proxy is the front end here. It is literally there to receive mail. Again, potentially could come from inside or outside, depending where we're looking at. But I would say for the vast majority of time and for the scope of this discussion, we're just going to be looking for external SMTP and going in and out. So once it hits this transport service, you'll see here there's a lot going on in this one. So this one here is where we have submission queue. So this is where it gets queued. So this is actually incredibly important because if it hits the submission queue, it's being essentially ready to be delivered. Okay, so it's we know where it's going. It is a valid recipient in the organization or outside of the organization, depending on where it needs to go. But what will end up happening here is that we will shoot this out. It'll be queued and it'll say, okay, we are queued for Joe at domain.com. His email is queued for submission. Okay. At this point here, it gets categorized. There are some other pieces that are happening on here where we have, there are some minor anti-spam, antivirus pieces that are happening through the categorizer, as well as over here where we have SMTP receive. In this instance right here, this is what we're going to be focusing on in lab, is going to be transport service as well as the transport rules. So there's a lot of things that happen on the transport service. It's actually probably one of the most important ones. But let's continue on. We got that piece of mail comes in. It's SMTP send here for an internal recipient. Comes in, gets submitted for queue. This guy will come over here and say, all right, well, we're going to categorize it where it needs to be sent and everything. It gets sent out through the delivery queue. So again, we're queuing up here. And at this point, we are going in lots of different directions. We have an option of going in 3, essentially, according to this. For the scope of Joe is inside of our organization, it's going to come in, get delivery queued, hit SMTP send, be routed through the mailbox transport delivery service. It's going to hit this, come in, and say mailbox delivery agent is going to hit its end destination, which is the local mailbox database. The local mailbox database is the end destination for this particular email. So Joe just got a little blip on his Outlook that someone delivered him a message. That's what happens every time a piece of mail comes in and hits the Exchange organization from the outside to get delivered to a valid recipient in your organization. And that's it. Let's take it the other way around here. Joe hits reply and sends it back out to Sally, who's over in another domain outside of their organization. Okay. So Joe is going to submit. He's going to use the mailbox transport submission service. He is going to send. We have these agents here, which are essentially going to send. So it's going to hit SMTP send here. A couple directions it may go. So in this instance here, we're going from Joe, his mailbox database, connecting out, going here, which is SMTP receive, queued for submission, just as we saw before, categorize, where am I going, delivery queued, SMTP send, then, if send connector is configured properly, we're going outbound, SMTP receive, SMTP send, outbound through the world. So again, all of these things are happening as we're going inside and outside of Exchange. Now, in this instance, in a well-architected solution, mail delivery should be within seconds. Once it hits the organization, it should be seconds. It should be in your mailbox. However, you could potentially see that this may be very convoluted. So let's take one of those convoluted examples. So in this instance here, Joe is on his email client, and he hits and composes a new message to Jane, who is over in another database. Okay, she's inside of the organization, but this other database is hosted on another Exchange server. So in this instance here, Joe sends it, and he does everything that is in the submission service here. He goes through and looks through, and he gets SMTP send and says, okay, where am I going? Where am I going? Who am I going? We are going to go over SMTP to the transport service on other mailbox servers, which is going to go to another server, which will then hit over here. And as you can see, just imagine this hitting another server coming in from here, SMTP receive, and then we get delivered. So that's intra-organization mail flow. That's not really that complicated. If we have Joe being sent here, what ends up happening is that Joe goes, Joe's sending to here, and it essentially will be delivered inside of the mailbox database here because it knows where to go, and we actually don't have to go through all of this process here. However, let's look at it from an instance of what is between servers. This is another thing we start having to look at here, is that this is only one server with one mailbox database attached to it. But again, in our instance, maybe we have two Exchange servers. We have half of our users in one and half in the other. Okay, that's fine. Well, if Joe tries to send out, we can do a couple different things. We can go directly from here and go out to that server, but what's in between there? Well, we don't know. That could be the internet. That could be a WAN link. That could be a site connection. That could be these two servers could be sitting in the exact same data center. We don't know because there could be so many different things there. What happens when this goes down? Well, that's where we start running into problems. So that's where we're unable to deliver. What's going to happen there? We're going to sit here in the submission queue waiting. Okay, so there's lots of things that could potentially happen here. So it's going to sit here in the submission queue, and it's just going to sit and queue. These queues are going to continue to build up because we can't make it to our next destination. Why do we queue mail? Well, queuing mail is very important because if we were to imagine Joe was trying to send an email and there was a temporary latency, maybe a transient error where there was something in between servers and we weren't able to queue, what would happen is Joe sends an email, it just never would get delivered. And whoever the recipient was, we'd have no idea. It would just essentially fall through. The submission queue here, as it jumps through the hub transport layer, is going to be submitted. It's going to queue here, and we will always have that in queue until it jumps to the next piece, which is going to be the delivery queue. And then from there, we're going inbound and outbound, wherever it needs to go. At that point there, we got to really look at it is that the transport service here is one of the most important services, because it can do more than just, we so far have been talking about user mail. Well, remember, mail flow works in many different scenarios. If I'm just a user, I'm using one of those client access roles, I'm using, whatever it is, and I'm trying to just send and receive mail to humans, that's fine, and that's essentially what we've worked through here. But what happens when we want to go up to a printer, scan something, and have it email to ourselves? How do we do that? Or if we have an application that emails us a report every day, what happens? That's where we use this. So in this instance here, the SMTP from other mailbox servers through transport service front end or mailbox transport submission service. So again, it's going to come in, it's going to come through here. We may go in several different sections here, but in this big instance here, I have a multifunction printer. I want to scan to my email. Well, I can't go directly to my mailbox because again, that multifunction printer is so just simple in terms of the way application works, is that it is just going to send, I'm going to go to port 25 to whatever destination you tell me, and I'm just going to pass it off to it. That's all I'm going to do. So again, that scan I'm trying to send to myself is going to come over port 25, which is where we are listening here on the transport service. It's going to come in. It's going to go through the submission queue categorizer and say, hey, where am I going to be delivered to? And then again, be delivered to that recipient. So again, in this instance here, there's a lot going on, of course, but if you break it down based off of the perspective of who's sending, who's receiving, we'll learn quite a lot from this, okay? So again, there's a whole lot of pieces here. As you can see, this is how it works. Hey, inbound mail hits the front end transport service, and it hits the mailbox delivery service, and then gets delivered. That's really it. That's how easy that this is an inbound mail flow. Very simple. Here's an edge server. Same concept applies. Remember, we have our perimeter network and an internal network. That's the big difference between the two. This is going to sit in our DMZ, which is as in the networking world here, this is a more open network that is going to essentially shield our production network here, which is the internal one, our LAN, and you can see that there is a firewall between the two of them. So inbound mail is going to hit the Exchange edge server is going to take it over, and it's literally going to do the exact same thing as it did before. Here's outbound mail. Depending on where we're doing, we may have multiple scenarios. This is why we send. So we start off here. We hit transport. If there's a send connector created with default settings, we will look through that here. Or if there's a send connector configured to proxy through the front-end transport service, we'll look at that. What's the difference between the two? Most of the time, when we're looking at front-end transport service here, is it's going to go outbound to the internet through something. That's generally what ends up happening. So it's going to go in one of these two areas here, but I would say for the vast majority of time, it's going to be using the front end, which is going to go through something, which is generally a hygiene appliance. So something there. We'll get to all of that in time, of course, but just looking through these scenarios. Edge transport service, the exact same thing happens here. And it's just essentially going through. The transport service is going to hit it, the edge server. We do not really need to know about the front end, as you see on here. It is not. Never goes through the front end service because we're going directly to this edge transport service. That's how the subscription works. So again, this has got a lot of great information on how these things work, what they do. Taking this, breaking this down here, this is a fantastic little diagram that Microsoft has for you, which I have referenced for you as well. So if we minimize this here and continue on with our conversation, mail flow, as you see, can get pretty complicated depending on where we're going. Well, let's start looking at mail routing. So we've looked at mail flow, just the flow of mail, but there's a lot more to it as well. So let's start looking at domains. So remember when I said earlier that depending on your organization, you may have multiple domains that you are authoritative over. Well, that is certainly the case. You may be one Active Directory domain, but you may have multiple SMTP domains. You may have multiple sides of your business. One uses this domain when they send out, domain.com, and then the other one uses example.com when they send out. That's all part of, they're all same users inside of your Active Directory and inside of the same Exchange organization, but you have multiple different domains that you're accepting on. So basically, the definition of this here is the domains that the Exchange organization is authoritative to accept and send on behalf of. So authoritative is very important there, meaning that you own this Exchange organization is the authoritative source for this domain. So think about it from this perspective here is that if it receives a piece of mail, let's just say that you are authoritative for domain.com, but you receive a piece of mail for matt@example.com, and you are not authoritative for it. It's not an accepted domain. It's going to kick it out and give you an NDR. That doesn't exist here. This domain is not authoritative. Get rid of it. We can't do anything with it. Great. We can do that. We can also set it to be non-authoritative, but as we said, as an internal relay. It's a little bit more complicated there, but essentially the idea here is we want to do some complicated mail routing perspectives where I am authoritative for domain.com, but I have an internal relay for example.com. So if a piece of mail for matt@example.com hits it, Exchange knows where to send it to. And it could go to a third party or another, another Exchange organization and another company. Who knows what? We don't know. And that could be a million different things there. There's a lot of examples around that one, but don't worry too much about that. So as we continue on here, we have accepted domains. So we need to understand what domains that Exchange can accept on. That's really it when it comes down to it. The next piece is connectors. Now we've said this a couple different times based off of when we're looking at the transport rule, the transport layers there around, hey, as long as the send connector is configured and such, well, what are the connectors? There's two types of connectors. There's a send connector, which is responsible for sending email from the organization to the next hop. Next hop really could be who knows what. But in this instance, we always have a default connector, a default send connector that is scoped for star. And we're going to look at that when we get into Exchange. But in this instance here is that we're going to set up a connector that is going to be scoped for domain.com. And we can actually say that all mail flow for every thing inside of Exchange is going to go through our default send connector, which is scoped for star. Star is a wildcard. That means anything. But there's one thing that you have to very, very, very much take into consideration when we're looking at Exchange here, when we're talking about mail routing, is that Exchange, when we're dealing with mail routing, the most explicit wins. Meaning I have a send connector for star, it's going to go this direction. But I have a send connector that's scoped specifically for example.com. It's going to, every time a piece of mail hits for example.com, it's always going to use that connector, whereas everything else is going to go through the star. And every time I make a new connector, which generally is not a good idea, of course, but every time I make a new connector for that, it is always going to use the most explicit one that makes the most sense. So in this instance here is at example.com, I may have another one that is smtp.example.com. That's more explicit depending on a scenario that I'm sending to. So again, whichever is more explicit, it's always going to win. So it's the next hop from the organization, not from your client. And this is one of those things that you have to understand, is that when I'm sending email, remember, I'm sending it from the server. I'm connecting via client access to that server, and I'm sending from the server. So it's from the server's perspective. I'm sending it from it. What we have on the other side is receive connector. Receive connector are responsible for accepting connections from remote destinations. So remember that example that I showed you before about the multifunction printer when it's coming in. We would create a receive connector that would hit the transport service that would say it's scoped for a specific IP address, and we are saying Exchange organization, you can receive on this connector any SMTP connections from these IP addresses. We scope it to a specific IP address set. We can scope it to several different other types of authentication mechanisms. There's a lot we can do, and I'll show you those. There's not a lot we can do in Exchange Online, but on premise here, this is where we start running into, we'll say it's actually a little bit of a hot button topic nowadays. But for now, just understand that receive is basically mail flow coming into the Exchange organization. I can receive it, and then I'm going to send it wherever that may be. So mail routing here, and we're going to look at all of this, of course, but again, I just want to preface this here for you to understand it. The next thing that we wanted to talk about here is that, okay, well, we can receive, we know where to send, and we know how to essentially, get this domain, get the mail from it. Well, we want to deliver it to people, right? Well, obviously that makes sense. But what types of people can we deliver it to? This is a big list here too, because there's a lot of different things, and you probably wouldn't even realize how many different things that a recipient could be inside of Exchange Online. So our first, this is the easiest one to understand. User mailbox, just a regular user, allows access to the mailbox via any method, whatever it is, whether it be potentially POP, IMAP, whatever, that's potential, but probably not a good idea. Through Outlook, through our mobile phones, whatever it is, that's a user. It's tied to a user. We have the ability to delegate permissions out for certain circumstances. We'll get onto that in just a minute. But for the most part, this is going to be tied to one user, and only really one user is ever going to use this. Why is this important? Well, we do have another type. This is called a shared mailbox. Shared mailboxes are very important. They actually have a lot of functionality in it, and they're designed for multiple users who are going to access the same mailbox. Maybe we may have a email address that is itsupport@domain.com. So if I were to send an email to itsupport@domain.com, it will be delivered to this mailbox. And this mailbox, think of this almost like as a hub spoke, if you will. The hub is the mailbox, and all of the users who have been given access to this shared mailbox are spokes. They all can look at the mail and everything that comes into it. So you have many people monitoring this mailbox. So this is a shared mailbox. So there are many people that are looking at it. If I were to reply from it, I could reply as IT support, or I could potentially reply as myself. Lots of different scenarios there, but shared mailboxes absolutely have their use case. When we start talking about Exchange Online, they have even more of a use case. We'll get into those here as we look at the Exchange Online portal in the lab, but for now, just understand that shared mailboxes do have their uses. We also have resource mailboxes. These are rooms, equipment, whatever. Maybe, hey, we want to book out this room on this date, and we want to book out the projector because we want to use it in there. Again, whatever it is. It's really for booking is the biggest pieces when we're looking at resource mailboxes, because again, in a large corporate environment, we may have multiple offices, we may have multiple conference rooms. We want to book them out to make sure that, hey, is somebody else going to be using it at this time? Well, we want to know. Those are things that we need to know. So that's what the purpose of resource mailboxes are. They're really not designed to send and receive mail. They're really around booking and delegate access. So delegate is a word that is important to understand inside of Exchange as well. Delegate means somebody that has been given access to do things inside of the mailbox. There's a lot of things we can do, whether it be calendar sharing, whether it be send and receive as. We're going to get to what those actually mean. But whatever that permission set that has been given to you makes you a delegate. Well, what other types of recipients do we have? Well, the next one we have are mail contacts. Remember when I talked about in the previous one about personal contacts that exist inside of my mailbox? Well, we also have the ability to have global contacts. Global contacts here are part of, which again, another piece we're going to talk is the global address list. So it's part of the global address list to send to non-authoritative domains. So I don't have to keep typing or looking up a specific person's email address because it's part of the global catalog. So again, everything that's in there, I could see it. But the biggest important factor is these are for non-authoritative domains. So global address list consists of everybody inside of my organization as well as contacts that are outside of my organization that the organization may want to look up and keep for various reasons. The important part there is I generally do not have access to edit those contacts for the most part. I certainly could be given access, but generally speaking, we don't see it used too frequently there. They're essentially created because they are contacts that exist inside of Exchange. We'll look at those. We also have distribution lists. So in this instance here, there's a pretty big divide between the difference between a distribution list or a shared mailbox. So remember when we said IT support at domain.com, that's a mailbox that we use? Sure, we could. The idea behind that there is that goes to one mailbox that multiple people have access to. Well, a distribution list here is let me move myself just a tiny bit out of the way. There we go. Is that it's designed to send to one address and be delivered to many individual recipients. So IT support could have a list of 5 people in it that's a distribution list. And when I send it to it, it goes to all 5 of those people. Here's the problem, and this is the big difference between the two, is depending on the context of that particular mailbox. IT support could be a whole bunch of people monitoring it. What could end up happening is that, hey, I need help, something's not working. If I send it to a distribution list, 5 people in that, in theory, all 5 of those people could respond to it and start, it cause confusion and say, hey, I'm going to help you out with this. And then, every single one of those people respond to it. Well, that's a problem. Inside of shared mailbox, we can actually see who responded to it. We can see who read it, who checked it. And essentially they're taking ownership of it. And then we can just kind of back off. Now, in certain circumstances, a shared mailbox could be useful. In other circumstances, a distribution list could make sense, which again, think about it from all of HR or one of those all employee ones. Those are fun. There's a lot of caveats to those too. But again, if we want to send a one-way communication type to everybody, that's where distribution lists really are effective. So there's a lot of different types inside of Exchange. Let's start jumping down and continuing with the different portions of Exchange. So we have our recipients types, and all of these really comprise to make a address list. So we have the global address list. Now we've talked about this here, is that this is automatically created from every mail-enabled object in the Exchange organization. The reason why I worded it as such is because every mail-enabled object is different than every user in the organization. So a mail-enabled object could be a room. That could be a mail-enabled object. Another mail-enabled object could be a contact. So contacts are not inside of, they're not users inside of your Active Directory. They are inside of Active Directory, but they are not users inside of Active Directory. So I say mail-enabled object because it is a big differentiation between the two. Global address list, this is just a giant collection of everybody that's inside of our organization. That's it. Now we also have something called the offline address book. Contains the GAL, or the global address list, and can be accessed offline. Well, that makes sense, obviously, but why do we care? What's the difference between the two? Well, the offline address book isn't as important as it is nowadays. So if we take you back 10, 15 years ago, remember the connection between Exchange and your machine, wherever it may be, was probably pretty limited, meaning that you were essentially kind of we didn't have the fast throughputs and speeds that we have nowadays. So the global address list is a real online connection. Every time I use the global address list, I have to make a connection to the Exchange server and pull all of the information. That puts a lot of strain on the Exchange server. And again, put us back 10, 15 years ago. Put a lot of strain on the Exchange servers. So what Microsoft came up with is the offline address book, where it is essentially getting written to. You have a local copy of it that exists on your local machine. In that local machine there, you will have the offline address book. And that is as of the time that it gets rewritten. Now, it gets rewritten once a day. I certainly, on-premise, can change that. In the cloud, I do have no control over them. But the offline address book is to reduce the amount of connections and strains on the Exchange server itself. Because again, every time we want to use a global address list, which again could be hundreds of times in a day, or even, who knows how many. You can go crazy with it, of course. But at the end of the day, the difference between the two here is that they're the same thing. The offline address book may be slightly behind, but again, it is designed to be local and offline. So, big piece to that. So those address lists are all of the Exchange pieces inside our organization. Everything looks good, great, wonderful. Next, I want to jump into around the topic here of mailbox delegate permissions. Remember, I said, what is a delegate? Well, what are the permissions that I can give those users? So we have many different types of them. However, I will go over the most important ones here, and really from the Exchange side. So the first one we have here is full access. So Joe could give, so Joe can't give full access mailbox to permissions to people. Because he is not responsible and essentially giving full access over his mailbox. So this has to be done on the Exchange management side. So administrators have to do this here. But full access comes in around the idea of I can allow opening and behaving as this user. I have full access to your mailbox, as the name implies. I can look at your calendar. I can delete your mail. I can send as you. So I can send an email. Again, think about what you can do with this here. You can get very, very dangerous with some of these things on here. Again, if somebody is given full access to a mailbox, they could send as that person, and they can say, Sally could send as Joe because she has full access to his mailbox, and send out to that all employee distribution list that says, hey everyone, I quit, and put that out to the entire organization. So again, we have to be very careful with how we use full access. Full access is a very important, we'll call it in terms of least privilege, it is the complete opposite of it. It's the most privileged. So in certain circumstances, maybe we want to use something called send on behalf. This is another delegate permission. This one here allows the delegate to send on behalf of the mailbox, which shows in the from field. So in that instance of IT support is that Joe picks up that he has send on behalf access to that IT support mailbox. Joe can respond to an email where Sally was having problems. Joe will respond, and it will say on behalf of, from Joe, on behalf of IT support. And you'll see in there is that, so when she responds, she can respond directly to Joe, but it also shows that Joe was the one that took it and is responsible now for that example, essentially. Then we also have send as. So this one here doesn't give us full access, meaning I can't delete everything. I can't really do much else. The only thing I can do here is send as the user. In certain circumstances, this is important. If we want to, again, maybe use that IT support example, is that we want to give Joe send as access. So when Joe responds, it comes from IT support, and then all the conversations essentially stay inside of that shared mailbox there. Other people can monitor it and everything as well. But it is essentially anonymizing who's sending because it's coming from IT support. We don't know who that is exactly. So it's important. You'll also see some of these delegate permissions here around the idea of calendars. Now, when you're giving calendar permissions to certain people, you can give them, there's like, I think 10 different levels of permission sets of what you have access to and such. But one of the more common scenarios that I see here is around the executives. Executives will have administrative assistants. And those administrative assistants are the ones that essentially they book all of their, everything. They book everything for them. They book their calendar invites. They book, whatever it is. And they're essentially the ones that are kind of in control of that email box. So a lot of times we may see full access on here. But also a lot of times we may see other scenarios too, where, in the organization, hey, I want certain people to be able to see free busy. So again, I can see if you're free, if you're busy, or if you're tentative, or out of office. That's all I can see, just very minimal details. But maybe I want certain people like my manager to be able to see the details of my meetings that I have. Those are things that we can do as well. So these are all delegate permissions. These are the most common Exchange server side, but then we also have the mailbox side, and more of the calendar side is the big piece there. All right, so we've looked at lots of different pieces here, and we're starting to put this puzzle together around the idea of, where does this all come into play? Well, if we look at the next piece here, which is just a sliver of what's to come when we start talking about compliance. Compliance, we have an entire section around it, but we have to understand why we are complying and with whom are we complying. That's the big piece there. First thing that we look at here is mail retention. Okay, so mail retention is keeping mail. Okay, so we need to keep it around. So a simple definition here is policies set to keep mail, even if deleted, that's important, for a certain period of time as determined by corporate compliance. It is very important to understand that when we're talking about retention of mail and keeping mail around and making sure that we have it, this is not an IT-only decision. Corporate compliance, lawyers, there's chief compliance officers, executives, there's a whole bunch of people that make these decisions here, and they say, we are going to keep all mail for 7 years, no matter what, and then we are going to delete it. And the reason being is that because this is a legal piece, is that as a corporate compliance policy, we keep all mail for 7 years and then delete it, means we have no mail that is over 7 years as a corporate compliance policy. At that point there, if there is some sort of litigation where we start needing to do e-discovery cases, we're going to talk about here in a second, if we need to start pulling this information out, we have to make sure by corporate compliance, we have to make sure that we have 7 years of data for all users that this policy applies to. Because if we don't, we're going to get into a lot of trouble. But in the instance of time where, hey, we're pulling in a lawsuit from 10 years ago, we don't have that mail. I'll give you everything I have, but according to our corporate compliance policies, we keep 7 years. That's it. So again, there's some variables that comes along with this here too. So we need to, this is why this is not an IT thing. This is really a legal thing when it comes down to it. We're going to talk about how it works and how it actually retains the data. Because again, even if the data is deleted, it's still around for e-discovery purposes. And we'll talk about that when we get to the compliance section here. But just to give you a top level overview. We also have journaling. So journaling is another way of compliance where we can take every piece of mail that's moving through the hub transport layer. As it's jumping through it, we can take a journal of it. That was one of those subcategories under there, is we could take a journal of it, which is essentially a copy of it. It doesn't keep everything that's related to it, but it'll take that and send it to a third-party location. Most of the time, it's going to be an appliance inside of your organization. It could be a cloud-based service, and it's going to take and throw it all outside of the organization for compliance reasons. It is very important to know the difference between retention and disaster recovery. It's throwing it to a third-party location that allows me to do discovery searches on that is not inside of the Exchange organization. Why would we do this? It's not as popular anymore because it's the biggest factor it comes down to is mailbox size. So journaling as a whole is not as utilized, but it used to come down to the point of, if I were to keep 7 years of mail for every user, imagine how much mail that is for each individual user. That's a ton of storage. And again, based off our conversations before, remember, one of the most expensive pieces of any type of application is storage. Exchange mail is huge nowadays to store all of this stuff because we're in terabytes worth of data of mail that we're storing on here. So journaling allowed us to take that before it hits the mailbox, and as it's leaving the mailbox, it gets sent over to the third-party location. That third-party location would store that mail. We can actually use other policies to keep our mailboxes cleaner on premise in our Exchange organization, so we don't have to pay as much for that very expensive fast storage. So journaling allows us to move it to a third-party location. Now, again, as I said, the difference between journaling versus data disaster recovery are very, very defined. Journaling is for e-discovery and litigation purposes only. It is not designed to be a backup of mail. Yes, it could be used for that, but that's not what it's designed for. Because the big piece of that is if you're paying for journaling, you are there's no purpose into doing it. You're paying a premium for journaling. Journaling is designed for legal reasons. Now, when we're talking about disaster recovery, where our mailbox died, our database just went corrupt and everything, it went belly up and everything in it is gone, well, that's a completely different scenario. That is not where journaling comes in. We cannot restore that mail from the journal. Yes, we could, but we can't do bulk mail, and it would take us 100 years to do it all. The journal, a journal envelope, only consists of certain amounts of pieces of that mail as well. So that particular individual email that it gets journaled through an envelope, it does not take every bit of it with it. There are certain pieces of it that do not come. So as I said, very important to know the difference between the two. Disaster recovery is a completely different scenario where we want to potentially back things up for disaster scenarios. If we are retaining our mail, that's fine, and that could be used to restore. That's perfectly fine. But in the instance of what happens when that mail catastrophically fails, a user, we've had corporate espionage, who knows what. Backups could certainly be used, and those could be in third-party locations. Just to give you an idea, I have some customers who are using Exchange Online. They're storing all their mail in there. They're retaining it inside of Exchange Online, and they think that is perfectly safe and fine there. Not a problem. I do have a few customers who say, our data is very much important to us because we do not want to put all of our eggs in one basket, and that one basket is Microsoft. Yes, that's a big basket, a very secure basket, but again, you have a 99.9% SLA, maybe that's just not good enough. Maybe if we've had a catastrophic failure in Microsoft's data centers and everything there, who knows what, nation state activities, who knows what. We can take that data and we can move it over to a third party. And I actually have a lot of people who back up Exchange data to third party and third party clouds. So Amazon Web Services. I've also seen Azure, whatever it is, but just a completely different location to make yourself as resilient as possible. It's not a bad practice at all. It really isn't, but it depends on the scenario because it also costs a ton of money. So a ton of money. Remember, it's a lot of money we got to look at. So again, at the end of the day, journaling is much different. Journaling retention is far different than disaster recovery. Very, very big difference there. E-discovery. Now again, retention, journaling, that is essentially the reason why you do it, and we need to be able to search for data. So again, I need to look at all mail that Joe sent Sally over this period of time, that because we got pulled into a lawsuit, and this lawsuit is looking for all data based off of these periods of time and all information that was sent to and from Joe and Sally. And that's just an example, of course, but that's what we need to be able to look for. E-discovery is allowed to search. Again, these are compliance factors. Data loss prevention or protection, DLP, is a big thing nowadays. I'm doing so much around this nowadays. Is we're stopping email if it's leaving the organization if it contains sensitive data. Well, what's sensitive data? I couldn't tell you, because honestly, every organization views their definition of what sensitive is completely different from the next. So we need to understand what is sensitive and what's not. So that's a big deal. Sensitive information could be Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, bank account numbers. We want to look for these things. Very important. We're going to have a whole discussion around all of these things here when we get into the compliance section here, but I just want to give you a high-level overview of why do we care about these. Legal reasons. I'm kidding you. These are huge. If you are leaking data and you have information that is going outside, or you have, as I said, that corporate compliance policy says 7 years, but because we had an accident a few years ago, we lost all of our data. Now we only have 3 years worth of data. You're going to get hosed, to say the least. It's going to be bad for you. So we want to make sure that we are compliant with our policy. All right, overall, the reason why we talked about everything on here was all about mail routing and mail flow. So we've painted a nice picture for it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put a nice tidy bow on it, but we're going to look at it in practice. What are some of these things that we can do inside of Exchange Online? So we're going to move over into that section here. We're going to play around with the Hub Transport Layer. We're going to do some rules around it, do some different things. With that being said, that is it for this particular lection here. We are going to move into the lab, and I will see you over on that one. Thank you for your time on this one.